Hi guys, and welcome to this lecture video on Ecology Part II. We're going to talk about symbiosis, predator-prey interactions, keystone species, trophic levels, survivorship curves, and adaptations organisms have to their environment. We're going to start talking about community ecology and how different populations of organisms interact with each other, and we're going to start off with a symbiosis, and basically that's an interaction amongst two different organisms. Sometimes it is benefiting both organisms, sometimes one is benefited and the other is neither helped nor harmed, and then sometimes that one organism actually lives in or on the other organism and actually harms it. So we're going to go through those three different types of symbiosis. So we're going to start off with mutualism. Here you have Marlin and Nemo in their sea anemone. This is going to be an example of mutualism. Here, both organisms are going to benefit from the relationship. You have the clownfish here, which is receiving shelter and protection from the sea anemone. So these tentacles that you see here will have stinging cells called nematocysts, and these nematocysts protect the home or the sea anemone, which is the home to these clownfish, and they also protect the clownfish by stinging any thing that comes in contact with them. And so most organisms are going to want to avoid the sea anemone because if they don't want to get stung by these stinging cells or these nematocysts on the tentacles of the sea anemone. So the clownfish gets protection, and it also gets a place to live. What does the clownfish do for the sea anemone? Well, it provides it with nutrients through waste products, and it also helps with filtering. So the sea anemone will be feeding via a filtering mechanism through the water. And so moving the tentacles around, swimming in and out, swimming around within the sea anemone, that's going to help circulate the water and therefore help the sea anemone be able to feed. Also, butterfly fish, a different species of fish from the clownfish here, actually enjoy eating the sea anemone. And so the clownfish actually scare away the butterfly fish from eating the sea anemone. So they'll poke out of it whenever a butterfly fish comes around and tries to eat the sea anemone, which is quite funny that the clownfish scares the butterfly fish away. So clowns are scary here in this example. Here's an example with plants, because I think plants sometimes don't get enough credit for being just as clever as animals. And this is the acacia tree. It grows in Africa, which is its habitat. And then these are acacia ants. And what the acacia tree provides for the ant is a place to live. So if you look at this diagram over here, you can see these little holes in the thorns of the acacia tree, and that's where the ants actually live. Now, the acacia tree not only provides a home for the ants, but it also provides food. So if you look here, you can see these little balls here of sugars that the plant will actually make and give to the ant for food. So the ant gets shelter and it gets food from the acacia tree. The acacia ants help the tree by attacking any enemies. For example, giraffes like to feed on these leaves of the acacia tree. And so when the giraffe goes to feed on the leaves of the acacia tree, that ants will actually attack the giraffe. Also, the ants will attack other plants that are competing for sunlight, water, for example, within a certain area of the acacia tree. So what you'll notice when you look at these acacia trees is you'll see that the tree is kind of by itself. There's not a lot of other shrubs growing around it, basically, because these ants will attack and destroy plants that are trying to outcompete the acacia tree because it provides them with a lovely home and food. Commensalism, I love this example. These small fish you see here are what we call remoras, and I love this little bumper sticker here. My other shark is a great white. And so hopefully you get a laugh out of that too. But basically what these remoras do is they swim here. Notice they're swimming back behind the pectoral fin of the shark, and they swim along for protection. The shark provides them with protection. Also, when the shark feeds, it will thrash its food about to break it up into smaller pieces, and the remoras can feed on that as well. And so the remoras get protection and food by hanging out here with the shark. However, the shark is really not benefited from the relationship here with the remora, and it's not really harmed either. So this is an example of commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. Parasitism. This is probably the most exciting example of a symbiosis. Usually the organism lives in or on a host, and that host then is harmed. And parasites typically get nourishment from the host. So we discussed the parasitic wasp earlier and how it actually lays its egg, or basically young, inside that aphid, and then the young keeps the vital organs of the aphid alive until the wasp is then ready to hatch out, which is a great example of parasitism. It's actually living inside that aphid and then getting nutrients by feeding on the aphid, and then keeping all of those vital organs alive until it's ready to hatch out of the aphid. Another example here is something you'll decorate your house with at Christmas time. Little do you know, but you're actually kissing beneath a semi-parasite. Now, when it's in your house, it's obviously not being a semi-parasite, but if you go out in the wintertime is when it's really easy to see mistletoe in a tree like this one here. You'll see these big green balls while the tree is not got leaves on it. You'll see that these really big green balls, and that's mistletoe. And mistletoe is considered a semi-parasite because it gets its nutrients from the tree. So the tree will provide it unwillingly. The tree does not want to, but basically the mistletoe will get its nutrients from the tree, but it also has the capability of doing photosynthesis and providing its own nourishment as well. And so therefore we call it a semi-parasite. Okay, predators. We have two different types. We have sit and wait and moving in search of prey. A sit and wait predator is good because it uses less energy to capture prey. Example of that would be the spider here. However, a negative to being a sit and wait predator is you would have limited resources. You have to wait for your prey to come along. It's not guaranteed that prey will come along at certain intervals of time. You may go a long period of time without a prey coming in contact with you, and so therefore you may go hungry. Moving in search of prey, predators, a positive or a pro about that is you get prey when you want it. You look for it and you go after it, right? You see something tasty and you head for it. You don't sit and you don't wait for that something tasty to come to you. And then a negative would be you do expel a lot of energy moving in search of your prey. Here I put an example of a cheetah on here because they use a lot of energy. They use fast bursts of energy to be able to capture their prey. Let's talk about prey mechanisms. So we have cryptic coloration, which is basically camo here, which you can see the chameleon doing here for the Valspar commercial. I absolutely love this. I think it's such a clever way to advertise paint. I mean, who would have thought a chameleon? And basically, if you haven't seen the commercial, she tries on, so basically she walks up to these different colored paints, and of course she is trying to blend in with the paint, and so her skin color changes to the color of the paint, and she's like, hey honey, what do you think about this blue? What do you think about this green? So clever by Valspar to use the chameleon there. So that's cryptic coloration. Then you have disruptive coloration, which is what you see here with the zebras. If you've ever wondered why zebras have stripes, one reason is because it is harder to distinguish a single individual apart. And so the coloration helps them when they are in a herd to not be able to be easily identified or singled out by the predator. And then my last two examples here, this is a poisonous dart frog. And then you also have the poisonous newt here, red newt. And these are going to be warning colorations. So you can see that they're brightly colored, which you would think that would not be advantageous in blending in with the environment. However, they're brightly colored to warn predators that, hey, I'm toxic, I'm poisonous, and so therefore, if you eat me, you will die, so stay away. And a quick fun fact for you here. This red newt has a neurotoxin that actually paralyzes the respiratory muscles. And so once you can't get oxygen, you'll have multiple organ failure. And so this red newt is actually a really, really cool organism. One of my favorites to talk about in class, actually. A couple of hikers out in Oregon actually boiled one of these guys in their coffee pot. I'm not sure if it was just accidentally put in there or if they meant to boil it in their coffee. My guess is an accident, but they actually died from doing that. If you were to touch one of these, you would be fine. But if you ingest it, their toxin, it is lethal. Mimicry. So one of these snakes is deadly. It also contains a neurotoxin which attacks your nervous system and causes paralyzation of muscles like the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles. And so which one of these do you think is venomous? And which one do you think is harmless? If you said the one on the left is venomous, you would be correct. So that is actually the eastern coral snake, native here to North Carolina. If you've ever heard of red and yellow, kill a fellow, red and black, a friend of Jack. Sorry, guys. Then that's how you can tell whether the snake is actually venomous or not. But over here, you have, on the right, you have the scarlet king snake, and notice how its coloration and patterns are very similar to the venomous eastern coral snake. However, here you have red and black touching each other, whereas with the eastern coral snake that's venomous, you have red and yellow touching each other. It's a good idea, if you're not sure, not to pick either one of these up, but I have held the scarlet king snake before. They're absolutely lovely, but yes, I definitely don't want to touch an eastern coral snake. But the scarlet king snake here is using mimicry as a mechanism to deter its prey. And if you're a hawk flying over, you can imagine that it's really hard to distinguish the two of these apart if you are far away. And, if you're a hawk and you're flying over and you're like, oh yeah, my friend Bob over here, he didn't live very long last time he attacked one of those. So they learn to stay away from those reddish yellow, things, slithering things down there on the ground. And so that's one way that that organism protects itself, by mimicry. Keystone species. I love sea otters. Are they not the cutest organisms ever? I would just love to keep one of these as a pet. They are so adorable. And here you can see that the sea otters eat sea urchins. Yes, I know. You would think, why would that be tasty? But it is for sea otters. Sea otters eat sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp. I don't know if you are familiar with big kelp beds out in California, but off the California coast. But if you look here, you can actually see how thick this kelp is in reference to the sea otter. And so there are really large kelp beds. You actually have to be very careful when diving in kelp beds because you can get wrapped up in the kelp. And these kelp beds that sea urchins feed on are actually home to fish and provide fish with shelter, especially young juvenile fish with shelter and habitat, because larger predators are not able to easily maneuver through these kelp beds. And so it's really a great fish nursery, if you will, these large kelp beds. And so a keystone species is a species in which if we remove the species, it will have drastic effects on the ecosystem. And so it's really key to the survival of the ecosystem. And so if we take out sea otters, what's that going to do to the sea urchin population? Yep, sea urchins are going to increase because there's no predators. And so if sea urchin populations increase, what's that going to do to the kelp beds? Decrease the kelp beds. And so therefore, if we decrease the amount of kelp because the sea urchins eat it all, then we're also going to decrease the number of fish. Because it provides the fish with home and shelter and habitat. And so it can really drastically affect an ecosystem if we remove the keystone species. The keystone species is really key to the survival of that ecosystem. You'll notice that if the keystone species is removed, a lot of times the ecosystem can change drastically. Vegetation can change. In the case of the wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park. That's another example of keystone species. The vegetation actually changed because they were eating the elk. The elk were no longer foraging as much on the vegetation, increased vegetation, changed the flow of the rivers. And so it can really, really damage an ecosystem or affect an ecosystem if you remove a keystone species. Or in that case, a keystone species was reintroduced to the area, and it was actually beneficial for Yellowstone National Park. All right, what do each of these feed on? So I'm not really sure. I honestly probably ought to check on this, but I put Taylor Swift on here as an omnivore, but she may be a vegetarian. I'm not really sure. But omnivores eat both producers and consumers. Down here, we have the cutest little gray wolf. He's an example of a carnivore which eats consumers. Over here we have a panda, which would be an example of a herbivore that eats producers, plants, and then we have up here a centipede that is going to eat decaying organic matter, which means non-living organic matter here, like dead leaves and animals, plants, dead plants, and these are called detritivores. All right, so organisms that produce their own food, that do photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, that make their own food are called producers. And so they always start out the bottom, at the bottom, the lowest trophic level here. So in these two examples, you can see grass and you also see phytoplankton. And those would be your producers here. And then the organisms that eat the producers are called primary consumers. So these are largely herbivores. They eat the plants or the phytoplankton or algae here. This would be zooplankton over here eating the phytoplankton. And the grasshopper eating the grass would be your primary consumer. Then the organism that eats the primary consumer is considered the secondary consumer. They feed on primary consumers. The tertiary consumer feeds on the secondary consumer. And the quaternary consumer feeds on the tertiary consumer. And usually you will only have about 5 trophic levels at max, just because of the amount of energy that's passed from trophic level to trophic level, which is what we're going to talk about in just a minute. So make sure you can identify primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and the producers if given an example. All right. Energy flow. So the amount of energy available at each trophic level is actually going to decrease as the trophic level increases. And so the amount of energy is 100% here with the rainforest leaves. And then the amount of energy decreases as the trophic level increases. This is going to limit the size of the food chain. There's a loss of energy through body heat and respiration, especially for warm-blooded organisms or endothermic organisms. They're going to need that energy to generate body heat. And a loss of that energy by that body heat is much greater in those endothermic or warm-blooded organisms. So they must eat more often than ectothermic or cold-blooded organisms. And so that's why if you have a pet snake, for example, or turtle, you probably only feed it maybe once a week. I feed my turtle more than that, but that's because I don't have to, but I just do. And he grows a lot because of it. But he doesn't have to eat that much. But usually you'll feed it probably like once a week, depending on the size of the prey, maybe even once every 2 weeks. But yeah. Okay, population ecology. You can see that the distribution of organisms in a population is not always equal. If it's uniform, which we have over here with penguins, basically the organisms in the population are distributed uniformly. So they have about the same amount of space between each other. Over here, you can see a school of fish. These are referred to as clumped distribution because they clump together, and that's a mechanism to evade predation here. And then lastly, we have random distribution or dispersion method here, because what happens when wildflowers and a lot of plants have a random dispersion pattern, because they are just releasing their seeds into, a lot of them are wind-based mechanism, and so they're just releasing their seeds into the wind, and wherever the wind takes them is where those organisms are going to land and grow. And so it is random there. All right, so survivorship curves. As you can see here on the y-axis, we have the number of survivors in the population, and then we have the age in relative units. And so I'll start with a type 3 curve, and here you can see that when the organisms are young, the number of survivors drastically decreases. So these are going to be what we call an R-selected. Most R-selected species are going to have a type 3 survivorship curve, because you are just making a lot of offspring and hoping there's not a lot of parental care going on, and what happens is a lot of those end up dying off very quickly and early in life, and then leveling off there. Type 2, an example would be birds. And so the number in the population is pretty linear throughout, no matter what the age is, throughout the life cycle of the organism. And so here, no matter what age, they have about the same likelihood of survival. And then in type 1, these organisms are, for example, humans, or these are more K-selected species. And because of the parental care and because of the small numbers of organisms in parental care, these are actually organisms that are going to survive very well at an early age, and then later on the numbers in the population are going to decrease significantly as they get older. You're going to actually go out into a cemetery and do a survivorship curve for humans, which is pretty cool. Right, and lastly, I want to talk about organism adaptations to their environment. So you have physiological, and physiological adaptations occur in the seal, for example. He's gonna have, isn't he so cute? He's gonna have a extreme amount of adipose tissue, lots of fat tissue to help keep him warm in his cold environment. And so all this blubber and adipose tissue fat is a physiological mechanism for insulation. And so all that's going to help insulate him in that cold environment. You can also have anatomical adaptations. Here, this is a springtail or a snow flea, and they actually jump from place to place. That is their mechanism actually to escape predation, which is pretty cool. They can fling themselves way up into the air, which would be actually to the equivalent of what it would be like for a human to jump over the Eiffel Tower, which is pretty crazy. You can watch this video if you click down here, or type this link into your browser, and you can actually watch a video about that. Pretty cool. But basically, anatomical adaptations mean that an organism has adapted to its environment by having certain anatomical features or physical features about it that are better suited for that environment. And then behavioral adaptations. Over here, you can see Jessica Biel and Justin Timberlake, and they're adapting to their environment behaviorally by recognizing that it is cold outside and putting on jackets, scarves, a hoodie to keep warm.